When my son got married, I kept quiet that I'd inherited my late husband's ranch. Good thing I stayed silent because a week later my daughter-in-law showed up with a notary, but her smile disappeared when she found out I'd already been to a lawyer the day before. I'm going to tell you the whole thing, not the short version. The whole version, from the beginning, because the short version doesn't explain why I made the choices I made, and if you don't understand why, the ending just looks like luck. It wasn't luck. It was 39 years of watching a careful man get taken advantage of by people who smiled while they did it, and deciding that wasn't going to happen to me. So, from the beginning, my husband's name was Robert, not Bob, not Rob. He hated both. He was the kind of man who introduced himself with a firm handshake and looked you in the eyes, not because he was performing confidence, but because he was genuinely interested in whoever was standing in front of him. He grew up in eastern Washington, second of 4 kids, on land his grandfather had homesteaded, and his father had expanded until it became something real. 480 acres, cattle, working farmland, 3 outbuildings, a main house with a wide porch that faced west so you could sit out there in the evening and watch the light change. Robert grew up knowing that land, loving it. He always said, land doesn't lie to you. It's there. It's what it is. Either you take care of it or you don't. We met in 1981 at a county fair in Yakima. I was 22, visiting a friend. He was 26 and had driven down from the ranch with 2 brothers to enter a cattle competition. What I noticed from across an aisle was that there was a man looking at me with a directness that should have been rude but wasn't. Nothing hungry in it, just curious, like he was trying to figure out who I was. I found out later he'd told his brother right then, I'm going to marry that woman. His brother told me that story at our 25th anniversary, and Robert turned red and said he'd deny it to his grave. We were married 2 years later. I moved to the ranch and learned, badly at first and then better, how to live in a place where the work is never finished, where the seasons set the schedule. I got used to waking before sunrise, to mud on everything, to the smell of the land after rain, iron and sage, and something older than both. I grew to love it the way Robert loved it, not as a possession, more like a relationship you have to keep showing up for. We had 1 son, Matthew. I'll come back to Matthew. Robert built the ranch from what he'd inherited into something substantially larger. By the time we hit our 50s, we had a cattle operation carrying 200 head, 3 working outbuildings, a manager's cottage, 2 guest cabins, and a main house we'd renovated twice. It was not a wealthy life in the way people picture wealthy. We didn't take expensive vacations. I drove the same truck for 11 years. But we did not want for anything, and not wanting for anything is, in its way, the important version of being okay. Robert got sick when he was 64, pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. We didn't waste those months on denial. We had always been honest with each other. We were honest about this too. We spent the time doing what we'd always done, working the land when he was well enough, sitting on the porch when he wasn't, making sure everything was in order. The estate planning was thorough. Robert insisted on it. He made clear that the ranch needed to stay whole. If you divide it or sell pieces of it, it stops being what it is. The house, the land, the operation, all of it transferred to me outright. He said, I want it to stay yours until you decide what happens to it, and I want that to be your decision, nobody else's. He died on a Thursday morning in late October. The light on the porch was the color it gets in fall, that low gold that makes everything look lit from inside. I was holding his hand. Matthew was there. We didn't say much at the end because we'd already said everything. The months after were the strangest of my life. Not the worst. The last months of the illness had been the worst. Grief, at least, is clean. Grief is just love with nowhere to go. What those months were was disorienting. I had lived alongside another person for 39 years. Every decision, every morning, every problem that came up, there had always been 2 of us. Now there was 1. I won't dwell on it. What matters is that I was not a fragile woman in those months. I grieved properly and without apology, and then I got up every morning and ran the ranch the way Robert and I had built it to be run. Our manager, Gary, who'd been with us 11 years, continued his work. The operation kept going. I learned the parts of the financial side that Robert had handled himself because that was what needed doing. What I did not do was advertise what I had. This was partly instinct and partly the advice of my husband's estate attorney, Mr. Ellison, a careful, quiet man who called me 3 weeks after the funeral. At the end of going through everything he said, I always encourage people in your position to be thoughtful about who they tell what, not because your family means you harm, but because money changes relationships in ways that are hard to predict, and once you've told someone, you can't untell them. I filed the advice and didn't think much about it. Matthew was my son. I trusted him. I had no reason to think anything would change, but people don't change when money enters a picture. What changes is that the picture gets clearer. The small signals you'd noticed and filed away, they come into focus. And sometimes what comes into focus is something you were hoping wasn't there. I had 480 acres, a working ranch, a number in an estate appraisal that I'd read 3 times the night Mr. Ellison gave it to me. I told no one. Not my sister in Portland, not my neighbors, not Matthew. When friends came by and asked how I was managing, I said, fine. I said, Robert took care of everything and I'm getting my bearings, all of which was true. But I didn't talk about the ranch. It was in my name. It wasn't going anywhere. And I had learned from 39 years beside a man who never wasted a word that the things worth protecting are often worth protecting with silence first. So that's where I was when Matthew told me he was getting married. Matthew was 41 when he remarried. I want to tell you who he was before all of this because he's not a villain in this story, even if there are moments where he acts like one. Matthew is a good child. I don't say that the way mothers say it about every child. I say it as someone who knew him closely and was honest with herself about his flaws, because Robert and I both believed that protecting your child from the their own weaknesses is not love. It's a kind of cruelty. Matthew was stubborn in the way where you dig in because you don't want to admit you were wrong, not because you actually believe you're right. He was also charming in the way that tends to insulate a person from consequences. People forgave him things because he was warm and funny when he wanted to be, and when he decided to be on your side, he was genuinely on your side. He was a good son. He called. He came by. After Robert died, he drove out twice a month for 6 months, which I know cost him something. He sat with me on the porch in the evenings the way his father had. I am not telling you a story about a son who abandoned his mother without cause. I am telling you about what happened when a particular woman got inside the part of him that was stubborn and started working it. He'd been married once before, Lily's mother. They were together 6 years, married for 3, and ended it gently. No drama, no betrayal. 2 people who had grown into different people and had the maturity to recognize it. They shared custody of Lily, who was 3 at the time. Matthew was on his own for about 5 years after that and had built a life I respected. Commercial real estate, old friends he'd kept since college, a close relationship with Lily, a habit of coming to me for advice about things he was genuinely uncertain about. We did not need each other. We chose each other. That was good. Then he met Dana. He called to tell me in January. His voice had that rehearsed quality, careful, braced for something. He said, "I've been seeing someone about 4 months. I think this one is serious." I asked what she was like. He said, "She's driven, she's smart, she knows what she wants." I noticed none of those things were about how she made him feel. They were all about what she was. I didn't say that. He brought her to dinner in March. I cooked properly. Pot roast, roasted vegetables, fresh bread. The kind of meal that takes most of the day if you do it right. Dana arrived wearing a silk blouse and heels that were not appropriate for a farmhouse kitchen in March. She came in and stood in the entry looking at the main room the way someone looks at a house they're considering purchasing, methodically, without warmth. She said, "What a cozy space." The word cozy landed the way it always does when used that way, a small, polite insult. She answered the questions I asked her in ways that were technically complete and emotionally empty. She did not ask me a single question in return. She looked at her phone twice during dinner. She ate perhaps a third of the pot roast and rearranged the rest in a way she probably thought was subtle. When I brought out dessert, she said, "Oh, I don't eat sugar." Matthew spent the whole dinner trying to bridge something that was unbridgeable and seemed unable to see that it was. He talked more than usual, filling silences, laughing a little too readily at things that weren't quite funny. I recognized what he was doing. I felt sorry for him. After they left, I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes and I thought, that woman came here with an agenda. I don't know what it is yet, but she was cataloging something. I told myself I was being uncharitable. Mothers often are about the women their sons bring home. I filed the thought and let it rest. I should not have let it rest. The second visit was worse. Not dramatically. Nothing you could point to and say, there. That was the thing. More like the first visit had established a baseline and the second confirmed it. She arrived alone. Matthew had to come separately for work, and we sat in the living room for 45 minutes waiting for him. She talked at me in a way that sounded like conversation but wasn't. It was extraction. She asked about the house, how old it was, how long it had been in the family, whether it was difficult to maintain. She asked whether I'd thought about what I'd do long term, now that I was on my own. Long term. I noted the phrase. I said I was comfortable where I was. I had support. I wasn't worried about managing. She said, "Of course. But as you get older, these big spaces can become a lot. It might be worth thinking about before it becomes a problem, rather than after." She was 40 years old talking to me like I was already in decline. I was 68 and had been running a 480-acre ranch for 14 months, but she didn't know that. She thought I had this house and a modest retirement account, and that was the whole picture. Matthew arrived, and the dynamic shifted. She became warmer, touching his arm, deferring to him on things she'd had opinions about 5 minutes before, laughing readily at small things. I watched it happen and thought, she's very good at this. I'm not sure what this is yet, but she's very good at it. They got engaged in June. Matthew called, and his voice had that same rehearsed quality. I asked if he was happy. He said, "She's exactly what I need right now." I heard the difference between that and yes. I didn't say anything about it. After the engagement, her calls to me started. Not often, not in a way I could have pointed to, but regularly enough that I understood it was intentional. She always called with something specific, a detail about the wedding, a practical question. But the conversations lingered, veering into questions about me, how I was managing, whether Matthew and I had talked about my plans going forward. My plans. She used that phrase more than once. Every conversation came back around to the same territory. What I had, what I was doing with it, whether I needed help. She always framed it as concern, but concern is specific. It asks how you're feeling, what you need. What she was doing was never quite that. It was always about the assets, the house, the finances, the future. I mentioned it to my friend Patricia. Patricia and I had been close for over 20 years. She was not someone who catastrophized, which is why I took it seriously when she said, "Trust that feeling." I know exactly what you're describing. I've seen it before. What you're feeling is not paranoia. It's pattern recognition. I said, "They're not even married yet." She said, "They will be soon. And once they are, the pressure will not slow down. It will get more organized." She was exactly right. The wedding was in August. I wore navy blue and had my hair done and thought, looking in the mirror that morning, that I looked like a woman who had come through something hard and was still standing. I thought I looked like a mother who was happy for her son. The venue was a vineyard an hour from the city, beautiful in the way that expensive things are, tasteful, curated, slightly cold, round tables with white linens, flowers everywhere, a string quartet. It was exactly the wedding Dana would have planned. I arrived early. That's habit. I found my seat. My seat was at table 9. I didn't know what table 9 meant until I looked around and understood the room's geography. Tables 1 through 4 were Dana's immediate family. 5 and 6 were the wedding party. 7 was Matthew's college friends. 8 was a mix of mutual friends. Table 9 was a catch-all. Dana's father's cousins, a man who'd worked briefly with Matthew years ago, a neighboring couple of Dana's parents, and me, the groom's mother, between strangers. I sat with that for a moment. I found Matthew across the room and he caught my eye and waved and smiled. Genuine, I believed. He didn't know where they'd put me, or if he knew, he had not said anything about it. In some ways, that was worse. During the ceremony, I watched him say vows. I looked for the thing you look for at weddings: the openness, the undisguised joy, the moment when a person forgets they're being watched. I've been to many weddings. I know what that looks like. What I saw in Matthew was something closer to determination. A man completing something he'd started and was going to see through. Maybe I was wrong. I was at table 9 and grieving, and maybe that made everything look different than it was. I want to be honest about that. The reception was where it became undeniable. Dana worked the room with the efficiency of someone completing a circuit. She was charming, I'll say that. Genuinely so when she chose to be, making each person feel briefly like the most important one there. She came to table 9 once. She stood at the edge, made eye contact with each of us for about 2 seconds, said something warm and vague, and moved on. She did not look at me differently than she looked at Dana's father's cousin from Ohio. We were both just stops on a route she was completing. Matthew danced with her 3 times. Her mother once. Her sister. One of his college friends pulled him onto the floor and they had a long joking dance that was clearly a callback to some old joke. And even from table 9, I could see him be fully himself in that moment. Relaxed, easy, genuinely happy. He did not dance with me. I don't mean he forgot to. I mean, I sat at table 9 for 4 hours and he did not look in my direction with intention. There was one moment, about 2 hours in, when he walked past my table and I put out my hand and touched his arm, and he stopped and I said, "You look happy, sweetheart." He said, "Thanks, Mom." And then someone called his name across the room and he went. I got a car home at 9:30. On the drive, I thought about Patricia. The pressure will not slow down. It will get more organized. I thought, we'll see. The first 2 weeks after the wedding were quiet. They were on their honeymoon. I did not sit by the phone. But when they were back, I knew because Dana posted a photo from the airport. I waited. Matthew didn't call the first day, which was fine. Or the second. Or the third. On the 4th day, I called him. We talked for 6 minutes. "How are you? Good. How's the house? Good. Okay, I'll let you go. Okay? Love you? Love you too." 6 minutes. On day 8, Dana called. Not Matthew. Dana. She used that particular voice. Warm, solicitous, practiced. She said she'd been thinking about me, which I doubted. She said she and Matthew were so aware that I was out there on my own. I said I had Gary managing the operation. I had neighbors. I wasn't on my own. She said, of course, but long term. She pivoted before I could respond. She mentioned a senior living community she'd driven past. Recently opened. Single level, so no stairs. A little cafe, a walking path, people your own age. The reviews were wonderful. She thought I'd love it. I said I hadn't had any trouble with stairs. She said, "Oh, of course not. Just for the future." I said I'd keep it in mind. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and tried to be fair to what I was observing. She called. Not Matthew. Dana. With a pitch about a senior facility, 8 days after the wedding, framed as affection, but structured like a proposal. That was not impulsive. Someone decided to do that. I called Patricia that evening. She listened to everything. Then she said, "Are you familiar with what elder financial abuse actually looks like? Because I think you should be." I did some reading that night. Enough to recognize the pattern: isolation first, then pressure around assets, framed as help, then urgency, then a document, presented in a situation where refusing feels unreasonable. I thought about the seating chart, the 6-minute phone call, the senior facility. I thought about the ranch. I had not told Dana about the ranch. Not Matthew either. Mr. Ellison's advice had stayed with me. Be thoughtful about who you tell what. The ranch was in my name. It wasn't going anywhere, and there was no reason to discuss it until there was one. I was beginning to understand that a reason was approaching. The night I decided to act, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. It was a Tuesday. Gary had called with a routine update, a fence line needing repair, a check on one of the heifers that turned out to be nothing. Ordinary ranch business. We talked for 20 minutes. After I hung up, I sat and thought about the fact that I had a 480-acre cattle operation, that the manager was reliable, that the land was producing, that I had a main house and 2 guest cabins and 3 outbuildings, and that the woman my son had married 10 days ago was already calling me to suggest I move into a senior facility. I went to the closet where I kept the fireproof safe. I hadn't opened it in weeks. I sat on the floor with it, which my knees didn't thank me for it, and took everything out. Robert's death certificate, our marriage certificate, the deed to this house, the investment accounts, the insurance policies, and the ranch documents. I had not looked at the ranch appraisal since Mr. Ellison had walked me through it. I knew in the abstract that the ranch was substantial. I had not sat alone with the actual number. I read it carefully. Once, and my brain skidded past it the way it does with large numbers. A second time, and I understood it. A third time, and I believed it. I am not going to state the number here. What I will say is that it was large enough to reframe everything. Large enough that sitting on the floor of my closet, I understood exactly what Dana was working toward, and exactly how serious it was. Not a modest nest egg. The kind of asset that changes a family's trajectory for generations if it stays intact and is managed well. And she had no idea it existed. She had been building an entire approach around the assumption that what I had was this house and whatever was in my bank accounts. She had been calculating around the wrong number. She didn't know about the ranch. She didn't know about any of it. She was moving against a target she had assessed incompletely, and the incompleteness was my silence, and my silence was going to save me. I called Patricia at 9:30. I told her I'd been looking at the estate documents. I said I needed to talk to a lawyer before anything else happened. She said, "I know exactly who you should call. I had the number by 9:45. Carol Briggs had an office downtown in a building that was plain on the outside and serious on the inside. The kind of place where the furniture is good and the atmosphere says nothing here is for show. She came out to meet me herself, somewhere in her 50s, compact and precise, with the manner of someone who has spent decades listening carefully to things people find difficult to say. She shook my hand, a real handshake, and said, "Come in, let's see what we're dealing with." I had brought everything. She went through it methodically, page by page, making notes. I watched her face. It didn't change much. She'd seen these numbers before, in the context of her work. When she'd finished, she set the papers down and looked at me directly. She said, "Tell me what's happening with your family." I told her. I told her about Dana, the first dinner and the word cozy, the second visit and the questions about my plans, table 9 at the wedding, the 6-minute phone call, the senior living pitch, 8 days after the wedding, the reading I'd done about elder financial abuse and the pattern I recognized. I laid it out plainly, without drama. Carol listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "What you're describing is a recognizable pattern. Isolation, asset assessment, pressure framed as care. The senior living suggestion is a standard step, relocating the target and gaining control of assets simultaneously." She said it without judgment, like reading a weather forecast. I asked what I should do. She said, "First, we protect the assets. Everything goes into an irrevocable trust. The ranch, the house, the investment accounts, all of it. You're the sole trustee while you're living and competent. No one can argue incapacity and take over without a serious legal fight." She said, "Second, document everything going forward. Every conversation about your finances, every pressure tactic, every document they present. You'll want evidence." She said, "Third, do not tell them what you're doing. Their approach is built on the assumption that you're isolated and uninformed. Let them continue on that assumption until it's too late for it to matter. You have more than they think. They've underestimated you. Let's keep it that way." We talked through the beneficiary structure. I knew what I wanted. My granddaughter, Lily. Lily was 15, Matthew's daughter from his first marriage, the one Dana treated as invisible. She was quiet and steady and looked more like Robert than Matthew did. She came to visit at the ranch in summers, just the two of us. She helped Gary with small things and asked genuine questions about how everything worked. She had never once asked me what the property was worth. I told Carol I wanted Lily as the sole beneficiary. The ranch, the house, the investment accounts, all of it. Carol made a note. She said, "That's straightforward. We can do that today." We spent 2 hours in her office. By the end, everything was locked. Irrevocable trust. Lily as beneficiary. Provisions structured to make the trust extremely difficult to contest. At the door, she said, "Go home and behave normally. If they come by, let them in. If they ask about your plans, say you're thinking about things. Don't lie. Just don't give them information. If they bring documents, call me before you sign anything." I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not calm, exactly. Closer to readiness. The feeling of knowing that you've done what needed to be done and can now wait. The week between Carol's office and the Tuesday was the strangest kind of waiting. I went about my days normally, or what looked normal. I talked to Gary about the fence repair, had dinner with Patricia on Friday and told her what I'd done. She squeezed my hand across the table and said, "Good." Matthew called on Thursday. We talked for 14 minutes, longer than 6. He mentioned they were settling into the new house. Dana joined the last 3 minutes, asked how I was holding up, that phrase again, as though I were under a weight, and said they'd love to come by. I said, "Anytime. You're always welcome here." I meant it. I wanted them to come. I wanted to see what happened next from my own kitchen table. On Saturday, I drove out to the ranch for the first time since shortly after the funeral. It had been too raw before, too full of Robert everywhere you looked, but I went now, and I walked the perimeter of the main house, and I stood at the fence line and watched the cattle work the grass near the western edge, and I looked at the land the way Robert had taught me to look at it, not as a picture, as a living thing with obligations and demands that gave back what you put in. Gary met me at the barn and we walked the property for an hour. The fence, the heifer, 2 pieces of equipment due for service, a question about rotating the grazing section for fall. I took notes. I asked questions. For the first time since the whole sequence with Dana had started, I felt like myself, not a widow being managed, not a target, a woman who owned a working ranch and knew what to do with it. That evening, I called Lily. We talked for 40 minutes, a long time for a 15-year-old to stay on the phone with her grandmother, which tells you something about Lily. She asked about the heifer Gary had been monitoring because she remembered it from the summer visit. I told her it had turned out to be nothing. She said, "Oh good." I was a little worried. I almost laughed out loud. Dana called Sunday afternoon. She said they'd love to come by Tuesday if I was free. They had some things they wanted to discuss. She said, "We've been doing some thinking about your situation and we want to share some ideas." My situation. My ideas. I said, "Tuesday is fine. Come by any time afternoon." I called Carol that evening. She said, "Be ready. Start a voice recording on your phone from the moment they arrive. Whatever they put in front of you, do not sign it. Call me first and use the card when the time is right." I practiced starting the voice memo until I could do it in one motion and slipped the phone into my apron pocket without looking. 10 times. Then I made soup and went to bed. I didn't sleep much. Not from fear. From the particular alertness that comes before something you've been waiting for. They arrived at 12:40 on Tuesday. I saw the car from the kitchen window, pressed start on the voice memo, slipped the phone into my apron pocket, and went to the door. Dana was in front. Gray blazer, dark pants, dressed like she was going somewhere professional, not to her mother-in-law's kitchen at noon on a Tuesday. She was carrying a folder. Behind her was a man I'd never seen. Mid-40s, receding hairline, leather briefcase, a tie. No one wears a tie to a casual family visit. Matthew was behind them both. He was not carrying anything. Dana smiled the moment I opened the door. The warm smile, the one she used when she needed something. She came in and kissed my cheek. She had never done that before in her life and said, "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling?" I said I was well. "Come in." The man introduced himself as Paul. He was a notary. He said it the way you say your profession when your profession is supposed to reassure someone. Forward lean, handshake, calm smile. I offered coffee. Dana and Matthew said yes. Paul said just water. We sat at the kitchen table. Paul on Dana's left, Matthew at the end. He was quiet in a way that felt unlike him. He kept his hands around his mug. Dana said, "We've been doing a lot of thinking about you and we really wanted to come share some ideas." She opened the folder. She said, "We care about you so much and we want to make sure everything is handled properly while you're still in a position to make these decisions clearly." Still in a position. I noted the phrasing and filed it. She went through it methodically. She had done research or had someone do it for her. She explained that financial advisors recommend simplifying asset structures as people age because complex holdings create vulnerability. She used the word vulnerability twice. She said she and Matthew had consulted with some professionals, she did not name them, who suggested the best approach for someone in my position was to consolidate the primary asset, the house, into a jointly managed account structure. That way, if anything ever happened, she paused delicately, Matthew would already have access. No long legal process. Paul slid a document toward me. He said, "This is a very standard instrument, ma'am. A power of attorney combined with a property management authorization. It gives Matthew the authority to act on your behalf with respect to this property." He said it warmly, like he was doing me a favor. I picked up the document and read the first paragraph. Dense and formal, but I understood the mechanics. This was exactly what Carol had said it would be. Transfer of control. Not of the asset itself, not yet. But once Matthew had power of attorney, whatever they planned next became a much smaller procedural hurdle. I looked up. Dana was watching with a pleasant, composed expression. Matthew was looking at the table. I said, "This is a lot to take in. I'd like to understand it better before I make any decisions." Dana said, "Of course. That's why we brought Paul. So everything is here and we can just get it done. I noted that too. Paul picked up his pen. Heavy, gold-plated, the kind meant to signal that signing something with it is a significant event. He set it in front of me. I looked at the pen. I looked at Dana. I looked at Matthew, who was still looking at the table. Then I stood up. I went to the kitchen drawer, slowly, without urgency, and took out the card Carol had given me. Plain white, her name and firm and number. I walked back to the table. I set it down in front of Dana. I said, "Everything has already been handled." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4. The kind of seconds where you can feel the air in the room change, where everyone recalibrates simultaneously, where the thing that was certain becomes uncertain, and the shift is visible on people's faces if you're watching. Dana picked up the card. She read it, set it down, picked it up again. Carol Briggs, attorney at law, elder asset protection. Dana looked up at me. For the first time since I'd met her, her face was doing something it hadn't done before. Genuine confusion. The deep kind, of someone whose model has just been contradicted by the evidence. She said, "What do you mean, handled?" I said, "I've retained an estate attorney. Everything has been placed into a trust. The house, my assets, all of it." Paul had gone very still. His gold pen was on the table. No particular energy, just there. I had the impression of a man quietly reassessing his professional exposure. Dana said, "When did you do this?" I said, 2 weeks ago. She looked at Matthew. Not a question. More like searching for a resource. Matthew was looking at me now. Not with the expression I'd expected. Embarrassment, calculation. With something closer to genuine shock. And underneath it, something I recognized from when he was young. The look of a person who has just understood they've made a serious mistake. He said, "Mom." I said, "Matthew." Paul began quietly putting the documents back into his briefcase, 1 page at a time. The gold pen went in last. The briefcase closed with a soft click. Dana said, "We were trying to help you." I looked at her for a moment. I had thought about this, what I would say when it came. I'd expected anger. What I felt instead was clearer and less satisfying than anger. I said, "I know what you were doing." I said it without heat. I didn't elaborate. There was no need. The card was on the table. The briefcase was closed. Dana said, "The trust. It can be restructured. It's not permanent." I said, "An irrevocable trust is exactly what it sounds like." She opened her mouth and closed it. I think that was the moment she understood she'd calculated the wrong picture entirely. She still didn't know about the ranch. I didn't tell her. What was done was done. The ranch was Lily's eventually. The house was mine for as long as I wanted it. Nothing Dana did in this kitchen was going to change either of those facts. Paul said, "Ma'am, thank you for your time." The voice of someone extracting himself from a situation he prefers not to have been in. He nodded at me, nodded at Matthew, did not look at Dana, and walked to the door and let himself out. Dana stood up, straightened her blazer, picked up her folder, said very quietly, "We'll be in touch." I said, "Through Carol's office, please." She looked at me once, then she walked out. Matthew didn't move. He sat at the table with his hands around the mug of coffee he hadn't touched. The house was quiet in the way it is after something that has been building for a long time has finally happened. I sat back down across from him. We looked at each other. He said, "How long have you known?" I said, "I've been paying attention since the first dinner." He said, "She told me this was for your benefit. She said she was worried about you." I said, "I know what she told you." He didn't say anything to that. I watched him do what I had watched him do his whole life when he'd gotten something wrong. Pull inward, go quiet, process it. I let him. After a while, he said, "I'm sorry, Mom." Properly. Not for a specific thing. For all of it. I said, "I know." He asked if he could come back on the weekend. Just him. So we could actually talk. I said yes. He left at about 3. I watched his car go. Then I went to the kitchen table and called Carol and told her it was done. She said, "Good. That's exactly how it was supposed to go." And then I sat there in the quiet with the afternoon light coming through the window the way it does in September. Low and golden and clean. And I thought about Robert. I thought about what he had said during those 14 months when we we were setting everything in order. Don't let anyone tell you what your life should look like. You've earned it. It's yours. Nobody else gets to decide that. I had not forgotten. Matthew came back on Saturday. He arrived at 10 and we sat on the porch with coffee for a long time before either of us said anything important. Early September, the light flat and white, a first edge of fall in the air. We listened to the birds. We drank our coffee. Eventually he said, I want to understand what happened. All of it. From the beginning. So I told him. Not everything. I left out the interior things, the nights of processing, but the sequence. The first dinner and what I'd noticed. The second visit and the questions. Table 9, the 6-minute phone call, the senior living pitch, the pattern I'd recognized, the reading I'd done, Patricia, Carol, what Carol had built. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, did you know this about her before we got married? I said, I knew something was wrong. I didn't know specifically. I didn't have evidence of intent, just behavior, which isn't enough to say to your son, don't marry this woman. He said, you could have told me. I said, I tried to, in the ways I knew how. I asked if she made you happy. You told me she was exactly what you needed right now. That's not a sentence with a lot of room for a mother's concern. He sat with that, checked it against his memory of those conversations. He said, I think I knew something was off. Not this, but something. And I thought it would work out. Or that the problem was my perception, not her behavior. I said, that's usually how it works. He nodded. I said, Matthew, I need to ask you something honestly. Did you know what she brought on Tuesday? Did you know Paul was a notary? He was quiet long enough that I began to prepare myself. Then he said, she told me we were coming to check in and talk about some paperwork. She said you'd mentioned wanting help organizing things. I didn't know about the notary until he was in the car. I thought I should just let her handle it. She said it was routine. I believed him. Not because the answer was comfortable, because I know my son. I know what he looks like when he's lying, and I know what he looks like when he's ashamed of something true. Tuesday he had looked ashamed. I believed the shame was real. I told him what had been in those documents, what the power of attorney meant in practice, what the next step would have been. I told him about the irrevocable trust, and then I told him about Lily being the beneficiary. When I said Lily's name, he looked up sharply. I said, Lily is my beneficiary. The house, everything else, all of it. He was quiet. I said, if you want to argue with that, this is the moment, but I'd like you to think first, he thought. Then he said, she deserves it. I'm glad it's her. And I believed that too. We sat for another hour. Gary came by and waved from the drive. Matthew asked questions about the ranch. Real questions, good ones, the kind that assumed he wanted to know the answers. I watched his face change as I walked him through the operation. When I told him the appraisal number, it landed on him the same way it had landed on me the night I'd sat on the closet floor. He said, all of it? Dad left all of it to you? I said, he said it needed to stay whole. Matthew looked at the yard. He said, she had no idea. I said, no. He was quiet again. Then, almost to himself, she had absolutely no idea. And he looked at me with something that might have been the beginning of dark humor. And he almost smiled. He said, how long did you sit with that and not say anything? I said, since before the wedding. He said, and you just sat at table 9. I said, I sat at table 9 and decided what I was going to do. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he actually smiled, genuinely the way he used to smile when something struck him as absurd. He said, you are terrifying, you know that? I said, your father said the same thing. Matthew stayed for lunch. We made sandwiches without ceremony, just opened the refrigerator and figured it out. We ate at the table. He asked if he could come back next weekend. I said yes. At the door, he said, Mom, I'm sorry. Properly. Not for a specific thing. For all of it. I said, I know. My advice? Be honest about what you know and what you allowed, and don't expect the consequences to disappear because you feel bad. He nodded. He left. I stood at the door after his car was gone and thought about Patricia's voice. The pressure will not slow down. It will get more organized. She had been right, and then it had stopped. I'm going to tell you what happened after, because I think you deserve the full picture. Dana and Matthew separated 3 months later. I did not cause this. I was not a variable in their relationship in any active way after that Tuesday. I didn't call Matthew, didn't push, didn't use what I knew as leverage. What happened between them was between them. What I know, because Matthew told me when it was over, is that once she found out about the ranch, through Matthew in one of the conversations they had trying to figure out if anything was salvageable, the dynamic changed in a way that was unrecoverable. She had built the relationship, at least in part, around an assessment of what was available. When the assessment turned out to be wrong by an order of magnitude, when the asset was permanently beyond reach, and when she grasped that I had known the whole time and moved first, something in her went cold. Matthew said it was like coming home and finding that she'd stopped pretending to want things to work. He filed in November. She didn't bite. She took what was hers, signed what needed to be signed, and left. Matthew described it as watching someone quit a job they'd stopped caring about. Efficient, without sentiment. I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing about that. What I felt was complicated. Not exactly satisfaction, not exactly grief. Something closer to the feeling after a long illness passes. Relief that the crisis is over, and a kind of exhausted recognition that you're now in the quieter work of repair. Matthew came back to himself slowly. He called more often. Real calls. He came out on weekends. He and Gary developed a working relationship. Matthew had always been interested in the land, in the same bone-deep way Robert had been, and being around the ranch reconnected him to something he'd allowed to go dormant. He didn't talk about what had happened very much. I didn't push. Lily turned 16 in December and came to spend the week between Christmas and New Year's at the ranch. She arrived with 2 bags, her dog, a young border collie, and a list of questions for Gary about the winter operation that Gary told me afterward was better than questions he'd gotten from some people who'd worked in ranching their whole lives. She walked the entire property in 2 days, in December cold, taking notes on her phone. She She asked about the history of the land, about Robert. I told her. It was the best week I'd had in a long time. On the last day of her visit, New Year's Eve, we sat on the porch with blankets and hot chocolate and watched the valley go dark. She asked, "Grandma, who does all this go to?" She wasn't asking because she knew. She was asking the way you ask things at 16, out of curiosity about how the world works. I said, "It goes to you. When I'm gone, it's yours." She was quiet. Then she said, "That's a lot." I said, "It is." She said, "Do you think I can handle it?" I said, "I watched you spend 2 days in December cold walking every inch of this property with a notebook." Yes. She pulled her blanket tighter. She looked out at the fields. She said, "I want to learn it right, not just own it, actually know it." I said, "I know. That's why it's yours." We sat there until the valley was all the way dark and the stars were out and her dog was pressed against her feet and the new year was almost there. What I want to say at the end of this is not something dramatic. I don't have a moral to hand you. What I have is a sequence of events and what I made of them. I was a 68-year-old woman who the people around me had decided was something to be managed rather than listened to. My son's wife thought I was a target. My son allowed me, for a period, to be treated as peripheral. The world had certain expectations of what I would do. Be grateful for the attention, defer to the people who seem to have a plan. I did not do any of those things. Not because I'm unusually brave, because I had watched a careful man for 39 years and learned to do what he did. Pay attention, trust what you see, move before the problem becomes a crisis, and don't let anyone else define the terms of what you have. Robert would have recognized everything I described. The first dinner, the senior facility phone call, the gold pen. He would have seen it all the way I saw it immediately and done exactly what I did, quietly, methodically, without announcement. Lily calls me every Sunday. She spent 8 weeks at the ranch last summer, working with Gary, learning the operation. She is 17 now and knows more about running this land than most adults I've met. She walks the way Robert walked, head up, taking in everything, always looking at the next thing she needs to understand. I have 480 acres and I know exactly what I'm doing with them.